Capcom has been doing their very best to milk Resident Evil for all it's worth, and while the remakes have been generally positively received, they've definitely featured some things that people were unhappy with, like censorship, but the next game in theory that should be remade is Resident Evil 5, and of course there are journalists saying that there is no possible way the company can straight up remake it because of the offensive content within it, and that it would need a complete and total rewrite. I have a few things to show off, but before we get into the topic, if you enjoy the content I create, check out the links in the description, follow me on social media, and consider supporting through Patreon or through YouTube memberships. Now, of course, IGN has been getting blasted over their recent Resident Evil 5 take. It says the Resident Evil game that can't be remade. I personally think that it could be remade, but of course, it really depends on if Capcom has the guts to do it, because this is going to be a remake that no matter what they do with it, it is going to face controversy. You are either going to have the company completely change the content of it, and then there are going to be people extremely upset with them for changing it and going in a different direction than the original product, or you're going to have these activists who are pissed off simply because they decided to follow the original works. But it says with Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's post-credits scene suggests, the remakes aren't over, and so the big question is where next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5, but on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not to the standards of Capcom's best work, and so the answer is to not remake, but to rewrite, which of course is complete and utter BS, okay? The remakes that they've done so far have been pretty good, even though they've all had their problems like dialogue changes or costume censorship, but even with 4, many people were saying it didn't need a remake, and they were already pushing it, never mind with 5, because I and many other people are extremely worried there would be major changes made to this because Capcom's remakes have again been pretty good, but they've been doing this balancing act between not changing so much that people completely boycott their products, but changing enough that people recognize the changes, and that is where the worry comes in. Capcom at this point in time, in my opinion, cannot be trusted with any more remakes. 4 was already pushing it, already stretching it. Doing 5, while yes, I do think there are some things that they could improve upon, like gameplay, I most certainly do not have the faith in them to continue the story in a way that, doesn't disrespect the original game, because I think they would go in the direction of major rewrites and narrative changes. It says Resident Evil is of course a survival horror series, not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but Resident Evil 5 is an action game through and through. I personally enjoyed this about Resident Evil 5 because while yes, it is very different from the other Resident Evil titles, I felt like having an action-focused game in the middle of the series actually played really well, showing that Capcom was willing to move the series forward. And of course, if you play it now, it definitely feels a little bit outdated. It definitely feels like it could use a combat refresh, but if they went in a totally new direction, they might as well not remake this game at all whatsoever, and they might as well just keep it the way that it is and stop the remakes of the Resident Evil series altogether. I personally have been playing them. I love Resident Evil. It's one of my favorite series of all time, but this is just not a game that I have faith in them to remake properly. It says, of course, even its visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s, but we all know what this boils down to. We all know that this is not just about the gameplay. We know that this is not just about the visuals of this title, and why so many journalists have for years talked about a potential Resident Evil 5 remake and why this would be a terrible decision decision for Capcom to remake, because of course Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of timeline, and it all comes down to what they deem offensive content within this game. There has been arguments surrounding this title for years. It came out in 2009, but when Gamergate began and this push for modern sensibilities became an industry standard, this game found itself in the spotlight because of content some people deem offensive and racist. I even just last year, in March around this time, had to talk about The Gamer putting up an article titled Resident Evil 5 is too racist for a remake, and you can find many articles like this on the internet. I have to say this all the time, but if you look for something to be offended by, you'll find it, and that's exactly the case with Resident Evil 5. Because this game is centered in a fictional West African country, there are people of color, meaning you have to kill them at some point throughout the game. And a big complaint has been with the fact that Chris and Sheva venture into the swamplands and are assaulted by natives wearing bamboo skirts and throw spears while screaming. But when you're talking about a place as big as Africa, not every single character is going to look exactly the same. They find this content offensive, but most other people don't. It just boils down to a creative decision the team made, and do I think that this is racist? No, and I'm not the only one. These activists constantly complain about there not being enough women or people of color. They ultimately want mob diversity, which should be fine, but when developers actually do it, it's a problem because they want these characters to have plot armor. They want them to only be the heroes, and that's just not the way the cookie is always going to crumble. And a whole other can of worms with this situation is Sheva herself. She is an extremely attractive, sexy, strong female character, and of course, if they decided to stick with her original character design in a potential remake, there would be piles upon piles of articles written by these activists about how the developers were sexist and they didn't respect women's bodies and they only wanted to make content that appealed to the male gaze, even though of course that's a ridiculous concept. So no matter what they did with this remake, they would be facing backlash. Now of course, if they decided to try to one-to-one remake it and they didn't change narratives, they didn't change character designs, I would definitely support it, and so many other people would as well. But I do think that at this point Capcom has been very focused on the modern sensibilities over the past few years, and we have seen changes in every single Resident Evil remake so far, even if in some cases they are smaller examples of censorship. They are censorship nonetheless, and they definitely do add up, and I just don't have any faith in them to remake this at this point. And of course, when IGN put up the tweet for this article, they were getting absolutely blasted, and hilariously enough, IGN decided to lock down their X account. They decided that they were going to lock the replies so that nobody could respond. As you can see, 2 million views, 2.6k retweets, and many people roasting them over the fact that back when Resident Evil 5 came out, IGN rated the original Resident Evil 5 a 9 out of 10. They said that it was near perfect, and they didn't have at that time any issues with the female character designs or the narrative direction or anything like that. And of course, you know, they have different reviewers, and the reviewer then does not work at IGN now, but it still is up on their website. It's still something you can go back and see. So it's hilarious to see them demand now that, oh, this game would get a total rewrite, when previously, IGN was all on board for this game and absolutely loved it. And this isn't anything new. Again, like I've mentioned, there are plenty of articles out there attacking Resident Evil 5 and saying Capcom would have to do total rewrites and change the game, and that this is their opportunity to change the past and leave this content in the past and make things better for modern audiences, which of course real fans of Resident Evil do not want. And we do not have an official confirmation that Resident Evil 5 remake is in the works. We could be getting something like Code Veronica next. We just don't have any information about that. But Capcom has been making a boatload of money off of the Resident Evil remakes, and it kind of seems like a no-brainer that they would go forward and remake Resident Evil 5 at some point. Only time will tell, but whenever articles like this release, I think they are hilarious and I love to roast them. And of course, IGN is getting absolutely blasted on the internet for demanding Capcom not just remake Resident Evil 5, but totally rewrite it. But that's all that I really had to discuss in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this, make sure to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you didn't, make sure to give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I will talk to you all again in the next video really soon.